going to be classic. Later on, there's going to be some breakout rooms and time to talk with other people here and stuff like that. And also, you'll be able to ask questions in the chat that we will then moderate, select, and the panelists. But just first of all, I'd like to ask Rob to do an acknowledgement of country. Thanks, Rob.
Thank you, Andy. I'd like to acknowledge that wherever we meet tonight in this country, we meet on stolen land. For the colonisation project to be successful, it was thought necessary to instigate a policy of dispossession of First Nations people and of policies that dehumanise them and repress their language, culture, and their very identity as human beings. I'd like to pay my respects to elders past and present across this land who have been in resistance and at the forefront of this repression for over 230 years. As our governments come under ever greater scrutiny over failed and inadequate climate policies, peaceful, non-violent climate defenders around the country find themselves criminalised with new draconian laws, demonised by media and governments, punished and harassed by police with non-association laws, and in a more troubling trend, denied bail and sent straight to prison. I therefore wish to take this opportunity to also pay my respects to those who now find themselves suffering at the hands of this repression and who continue to stand bravely on the front lines, demanding real and meaningful action on the climate crisis.
Thank you, Rob. And just a reminder as well that some people in here might have non-association orders with various police forces. So that might mean that it's wise to keep your camera off, names changed for various reasons, etc.
Andy, can I just mention as well that people are reasonably careful what they say or not with regards to a few of us here involved in ongoing court cases, and just to be mindful about what you're saying or not, and the people involved are mindful of themselves, but just to be a little bit careful because we have got long-term friends and comrades here. And yes, there may be friends here that are not friends.
Exactly. Couldn't have said it better myself. Thank you very much. Okay, so I guess very briefly, the reason some of us are brought here today was sort of brought up in those videos to do with Fireproof Australia and I mean, the climate crisis in general. And so on that note, where are we at this point in time is something that I think we're pretty shocking. That we've been in a La Nina the last couple of years, yet it's actually still climbing in terms of the hottest years on record. And this is because of the huge amount of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, which is affecting the Earth's energy balance and leading to an imbalance. So we're seeing massive flooding across this continent and across many places in the world. Yet I think personally, I'm really concerned about the El Niños that are to come, knowing that the extreme droughts that led to the big bushfires happened in El Niño neutral years. So we have a lot of heat and energy baked into the system, as they say, and it is an extreme emergency. The Australian Security Leaders Climate Group, I think it's intense but important to remember the existential nature of the threat that we face and to really grasp with what that means. So I'm just going to read a small statement describing an existential threat, which is one posing permanent, large, negative consequences to humanity, which may never be undone, either by annihilating intelligent life or permanently and drastically curtailing its potential. Context in which we meet today is that we're facing an existential threat. And our government response, last I read, 114 new coal and gas projects in development in Australia, and 24,000 kilometers of oil pipelines planned globally, least of all speaking to the gas and coal projects that are also planned. So most of us are probably aware that the situation is not rational or sane or just. So in that context, people have been standing up, taking action. And I would just like to ask the audience here to raise your hand if you yourself have participated in a protest. Could be for anything. Oh yeah, quite a few hands up there. Now, I reckon keep your hand up if the protest either inconvenienced someone or disrupted someone or something. Quite a few hands still in the air. That's exciting, because we all know that a good protest should not inconvenience or disrupt anyone if we're to be following by the rules of the state. Great. Now, good to have you here in the room, everyone. But of course, we are meeting in the context where people doing disruptive protest are getting extremely harshly penalized. So on that note, I would just like to introduce before I go on. So currently, as was summarized in those videos, Fireproof Australia, which is, there's a few supporters of Fireproof Australia in this project. In February and March, we were blocking roads in Sydney, and with these 3 reasonable demands to get sovereign aerial firefighting fleet, as recommended by the Bushfire Royal Commission, to rehome the bushfire survivors that were still unhomed 2 years later, and to have a plan for rehoming flood survivors, and to install these smoke filters in schools, aged care and disability facilities. Some progress has been made on those things in light of the new government in place, but we're still a way to go. And also, what's pretty clear is that the fossil fuel industry not only are making obscene profits currently, they're also receiving subsidies from the government, from taxpayers, directly, indirectly, at the scale of $22,000 a minute. So that's what Stop Fossil Fuel Subsidies is, a campaign of civil resistance that's ongoing, which is about redirecting this money away from the fossil fuel industry so that it can be used for things like protecting the community. That's what we need to do. But yeah, enough from me. We'll hear a bit more about Stop Fossil Fuel Subsidies after this, but for now, we'd just like to introduce the speakers, which and then what's going to happen is they're all going to speak for about 5 minutes each, and then we're going to have a panel, a forum thing where you can ask questions, and we'll have about 20 minutes of question time and answering from them. And then after that, time to meet and chat in breakout rooms as well. So I wonder if I should, so basically the speakers tonight, we've got Violet Coco, a supporter of Fireproof Australia, and member of Extinction Rebellion, supporter of Extinction Rebellion, and activist who has been recently sentenced to 15 months jail for 25-minute roadblock, parking a truck on Sydney Harbour Bridge. Fortunately, she's out on bail now and here to speak with us. We also have Ben Pennings, who, according to his Twitter, is a parent and small business owner, currently being sued by Adani for $17 million. So that's going through the Supreme Court at the moment. Talk about David and Goliath. And we have Sophie McNeill, journalist, author, and researcher for the Human Rights Watch. Really great to have you on the show. And Ian Dunlop, who's here in his personal capacity as a member of the Breakthrough National Centre for Climate Restoration, member of the Club of Rome, and the former chair of the Australian Coal Association. So we'll have 5 minutes each. Really excited to hear your presentations, and yeah, would like to start with you, Violet.
Thanks. Presentation, good. Any direction on what specifically you want me to talk in the presentation, Andy? Or
Oh, sorry. I thought you had more of a briefing. Basically, why don't you tell us about your experience recently in facing repression and maybe why you're doing what you do?
yeah, cool. Great. So I started doing what I do sort of early 2019. Had no concept of being an activist or how awful the planet and climate emergency was. And gosh, I remember my sister calling me up one day and just being like, Violet, I'm so concerned about the climate and the planet and this global warming thing. And I was like, yeah, I know. And she was like, no, I'm really concerned. And I was like, yeah, me too. But I wasn't really concerned. I'd seen on my news feed, I'd seen like polar bears or whatever, but I wasn't a scientist, I wasn't a politician. And so I thought, well, it's not really my responsibility, and just kept going on with my normal life. And then I suppose I was doing a bit of traveling around Australia and I saw how dry things were, and that sort of got me a little concerned. This was prior to the bushfires. And then I landed in Melbourne, which is one of the top 10 activist cities in the world, and it definitely I learned how to be an activist there. And I went to one of the Extinction Rebellion, heading for extinction talks, heading for extinction and what to do about it. And within 2 hours, I just had my mind blown on how bad the situation was, the fact that we're heading for an existential crisis, that billions of people are going to die, that our food supply is under threat, that our oceans are dying, that it was just really crazy. And I kept and then also like the social science of the fact that if you have 3.5% of the population actively engaged in political movement, in civil resistance, but protesting at one given time, then no one has ever failed if they've managed to mobilize 3.5% of the population. So that made me really hopeful. And the fact that civil resistance is one of the most powerful ways of shaping world politics. You had Christina Figueres' quote in there saying that civil resistance is not just a moral choice, it's the most powerful way of shaping world politics, and it's time now to participate wherever possible. You have people like David Attenborough saying we cannot be radical enough. And you have people like Professor Hans Schellenhuber saying that we're reaching the end game. I remember the first 2 months just hearing Greta in my head, that quote, I want you to act as if your house is on fire, because it is. And then within 2 months, the whole country was on fire. And at that time, my sister was also pregnant. And so I had to go and take care of her because she couldn't leave the house because the air was toxic. And so I came back to Sydney and was doing that. And it's been a really crazy journey since then of finding out what it means to have courage and to face fear and to face uncomfortable situations. It's really difficult what we do. It's not fun protesting, but we make it fun with each other. We try and keep each other's spirits up and use art art is the armor of the peaceful. Really, it makes us strong when we're in those difficult situations, facing police and facing repression. I think that we knew the trajectory. I mean, honestly, we cannot overthrow the powers that we're facing non-violently, and it has to be non-violent. You're twice as likely to succeed with non-violence, so it's such an important part of our philosophy. So you can't engage in protest and to the point of mass social change without them trying to repress us, and that includes being arrested and being thrown in prison. And so yeah, we knew that this was a possible trajectory, obviously hoping that it wasn't, but prepared to face that in some ways. And especially because prior to this action, they had just changed the laws to make it a 2-year prisonable offence to block a road. And so but you know, when it comes to thinking about what we face and what we're willing to do, I think about my little nephews, and I think about their future and what I would do to protect them from starving and going through what's already happening. You know, I live in Lismore at the moment, and seeing the devastation that's run through those towns. What are we willing to do to protect humans and protect animals and the ecosystems? And so I saw, so I guess, I spent 11 days in prison. I was sentenced to 15, and I'm so grateful that people stood up against that repression and united, and we saw a uniting force like we haven't seen for a long time. And I feel really grateful and honored to be the subject at the end of that, I guess. But I just want you to know that I'm not the only person facing this. If you don't already know, there are many other activists who have been sentenced to prison. Andy, who's one of our panel leaders, is you know, he was sentenced to 3 months. He only spent 20 days, but Max and Tim and a few others. So we have to keep up this solidarity to protect our right to protest, because we really need to be engaging in this time in changing that trajectory of billions of lives lost. And together we can do that. Okay.
Thanks, Violet. On that important note, there are currently about 26 climate activists in prison in the UK, as well as other parts of the world, quite possibly. Been in there for months, many of them already. On that note, would like to invite, I think, Ben. Would you please introduce yourself and tell us a bit about what's going on?
Yeah, I think Sophie's next, but I'm happy to jump in.
You know the panel better than me. Sophie, you're next.
Sure, happy to. Thanks for that, Andy. Just like to acknowledge I'm joining you from Fremantle in West Australia, and I'm on the land of the Whadjuk people of the Noongar Nation. My name is Sophie McNeill. I'm a senior researcher for Human Rights Watch in Australia. And I thought I'd just quickly say why I got involved in climate work. I was a reporter with the ABC and SBS for nearly 2 decades. I was based in the Middle East and covered a lot of war crimes, a lot of people fleeing horrific situations. And one thing that always stuck in my mind was seeing these parents who couldn't tell their children that everything was going to be okay. That's what I saw in Gaza, in Yemen, in Syria, in Iraq. And as a parent myself, it was just something that would strike me to the core. I had always been able to tell my kids that everything was going to be okay. And it just was this horrific kind of just relationship parents had with their kids all over the Middle East. They could never promise that they'd be okay. And, when I moved back to Australia and I started working for Four Corners, and I took my boys along to school strike in Sydney. And I remember my 6-year-old at the time, Quinn, saying to me, as he listened to the speeches and we had our signs, everything's going to be okay, isn't it, Mum? Like, we're going to fix this, aren't we? And for the first time, I could suddenly relate to all of those parents that I'd spent 15 years hearing their stories, and it just hit me like a truck. It was a bit embarrassing. It hadn't happened before, really. And then I went and did a story in the Amazon for Four Corners, looking at the deforestation under Bolsonaro. And this was, basically it was the reason I left journalism, was to do climate work like this for a human rights organization. So it's been really an honor to start this work in Australia for Human Rights Watch. It's something pretty new for us, but I just think it's such an important voice to have one of the world's largest international human rights organizations speaking out on these issues. And we've got to the point now where, as an organization, we say that the climate crisis is the biggest global threat to human rights that we've seen in our lifetime. And I know for a lot of people here that might not sound new to you, but for an organization like ours to state that so definitively is really important. And it's, it's always one of the first things I say when I meet with someone in Canberra, just so they know that we put this on the same level as our work on war crimes and, mass human rights abuses around the world. And the kind of language that we use at Human Rights Watch is, we talk about how climate change can fuel conflict, particularly over increasingly scarce resources, how it can fuel xenophobia and authoritarian rule as well over conflict over increasingly scarce resources, and how it will also strain the capacity of states to protect the most at risk because their resources will be severely strained and in many places broken. So that's kind of some of the language that we use at Human Rights Watch. Our positions are very clear. We say no new fossil fuel projects, no fossil fuel subsidies. So again, it's often helpful, I find, in advocacy. We're not Greenpeace. We're a human rights group saying no new fossil fuel projects. So that's a large part of our work, that kind of advocacy and campaigning, but we're also documenting the harms of climate change, and in particular how it hits the most vulnerable first. So, I've been on the ground in Lismore after the floods, documenting how it was mainly older people and people with disabilities who suffered some of the worst impacts of that particular extreme weather related climate disaster. But protecting the right to peaceful protest obviously is one of our most fundamental human rights. And so as soon as those laws passed in March in New South Wales, putting people like Violet in prison for up to 2 years and $22,000 in fines, we realised that this is really something that we have to concentrate on and do research and advocate on here in Australia. So I just thought I'd quickly summarise some of the findings that Human Rights Watch has made in relation to climate activists in Australia. So we've found that climate protesters are being increasingly and disproportionately subjected to vindictive legal action by Australian authorities, and that this is restricting the rights to freedom of peaceful assembly and freedom of expression. And what alarms us so much is that the actions by Australian authorities against climate activists appear aimed at curtailing climate activism more generally. So we know what they're up to here, that the reason we're seeing such disproportionate sentences and such excessive kind of attention by the police is because that's the end goal, to try and curtail that activism. It's just important to point out that the UN Human Rights Committee basically, in terms of its comments on the right to peaceful assembly, which is, of course, something that Australia is obliged to follow under international law, it says that when criminal or administrative sanctions are imposed on organisers of or participants in a peaceful assembly for their unlawful conduct, such sanctions must be proportionate and non-discriminatory in nature. And of course, that's what we've found is not happening in Australia. So what I did in terms of the research on this is, after those New South Wales laws passed, I went to New South Wales and I interviewed Andy and Violet, who's here tonight, and also Max Kermy and also Jay. So I'll just give you a few kind of summaries from those cases as to what we found so concerning. With Andy's case, when he ran onto the pitch in April at the stadium in Sydney with his flare and in his peaceful protest action. What was fascinating is that the magistrate who sentenced Andy said that the objective seriousness of the matter sits in the lower range. So he made those comments, we have the court documents. However, he then denied Andy bail and sentenced him to 3 months. So that's what really, piques our concern, because it seems clear that a disproportionate sentence was being imposed for politically motivated reasons. We also found that, apart from these lengthy sentences imposed for politically motivated reasons, that magistrates were handing down overly strict bail conditions. So under the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, you're not meant to punish someone before they have their trial, right? But when you put someone like Violet under house arrest for the 21 days that she was under, that is, akin to putting her in prison for that time. And that, again, it's another violation that Australia is incurring. So these are some of the rights that are relevant when we're looking at these cases. Similar with Jay's case, Jay was on the bridge with Violet, and Jay was under house arrest for 42 days. Again, it's that punishing him before his trial violates that covenant that Australia is a signature to. And I always remember when I interviewed Jay, he told me the story of when the police came around to check on him to ensure he was abiding by this horrific house arrest. And the cop, Jay's a very kind of lovely, slim built guy, would not hurt a fly. And so this policeman was like, "What have you done, mate? Like, I've been, I keep having to come around and check that you're at home." And Jay explained the protest that he'd been a part of. And this policeman said, "Oh, all power to you." So I thought that was a really, quite indicative to hear that from the policeman's mouth himself. And then Max's case, I went to court with Max and his lawyer and his sister and heard kind of his appeal. So Max had spent just 17 days, it was just under 3 weeks inside Silverwater Prison when he was first arrested for his protest that took place at Botany Ports. What was really interesting is that when the case went to the district court, the judge there said that Max was denied the benefit of a sentencing assessment report. And he also said that the magistrate seemed determined to imprison him. So those were the comments from the district court judge as Max appealed his case. So again, it shows that disproportionate, that politically motivated sentencing that we've been seeing in New South Wales. And so that was fantastic to have Max's sentence overturned at that time and to see his house arrest order lifted as well. And then, another example of these excessive charges and the disproportionate charges was when Violet was also charged with incitement offences because she live streamed her protest. So that was eventually dropped, if I'm correct, Violet, I'm pretty sure, yeah. But again, these excessive charges for, incitement is normally a very serious charge and terrorism related offences and things like that. So to hit her with that charge, I think, is quite indicative of what's going on with the politics in New South Wales. So yeah, all of those 4 cases really indicate how climate protesters in Australia are being targeted for disproportionate punishment. Sorry, I'm kind of trying to summarise quickly. We've also seen the Tasmanian Parliament pass new laws which just a few months ago, which sees protesters fined up to $9,000 and jailed 18 months for a first offence. In Victoria, it's $14,000 in fines and up to 12 months in jail. That legislation was passed just before their state election and unfortunately didn't get much attention before their state election. And then, in the lovely police state of Western Australia, we don't even have new anti-protest laws here. But Rosa, who's on the call, and someone might want to ask her about this later, Rosa was one of the 6 Extinction Rebellion activists arrested outside Woodside in Perth. And not only was Rosa just taking photos of the protest, but she had the pleasure of having the anti-terrorism forces come and raid her house, and that'll 5 other activists in the early hours of the morning here in Perth. And it was good though to see the magistrate threw out Rosa's case as soon as that hit court. So obviously this is from Human Rights Watch's perspective, we're alarmed that this is a global trend. It's not just happening in authoritarian countries. It's clearly happening now in democracies like the UK, whereas Andy pointed out there's currently 26 people in jail. Here in Australia, we were very involved at COP in highlighting the Egyptian government's crackdown on environmental NGOs and activists in Egypt in the lead up to COP. And, how can you have a COP to discuss climate change and what needs to be done when the government hosting the UN conference on climate change is, going around house to house and arresting climate activists. So that's some of the work we've been doing. we helped bring Violet's case to the attention of the UN Special Rapporteur on freedom of association and peaceful assembly. And he made some very strong comments that were reported by the press when Violet was initially sentenced to 15 months in jail. And just one last point to kind of leave on. One thing we like to point out is that, you know, when Australia acts like this, it really harms our ability to lead in the region on human rights. So, you know, we do a lot of work with authoritarian governments in Asia, you know, pleading for them to release, you know, this peaceful protester from jail or this union leader. Recently, all my colleagues documenting the protests in China, the white paper protests of incredibly brave, courageous Chinese activists. So, you know, for when we make the global headlines and I have Le Monde journalists asking me, why is this happening in Australia? You know, there is no good explanation. It's deeply embarrassing. We need to be a leader on human rights in our region, particularly as we see the rise of authoritarianism all around us. So we always like to point that out and highlight how it really undermines that important work on that level at a wider scale, looking at human rights in Asia. Thanks. I'll be around to ask questions.
Thank you, Sophie. That was fully insightful and awesome. Great to have a researcher on the panel. Ben, would love to hear from you and your experience facing this corporate Goliath. And however you choose to tell this story, really keen to hear.
Thanks, Andy, and thanks to Sophie and Violet as well. I'm currently online from Turrbal country in the north of Brisbane, and it's been quite. The other thing I want to recognise is sad news, but not sad news, because there's a older member of the activist community around the country, a very well-known actor by the name of Tony Barry, has passed away recently. He's a member of my union, which I assume is Sophie's union as well, the MEAA, and an acting icon in Australia who, I met at Bentley Blockade and elsewhere, has passed away recently. I think it's really important to recognise the people who've been involved in struggles for, many decades when they pass away, that we recognise that. So I want to recognise that today. And I really want to thank both Violet and Sophie for bringing in, what's more, I suppose, personal. I think the personal is powerful, and many of us have been to Zoom things where we get all political and shouty, or been to many activist things where we get political and shouty, but I think the personal is important. And sitting here, I remember listening to Violet that a little while back, before she went inside, for want of a better word, Violet did a post on Facebook, which I shared, and my 18-year-old who's in the house somewhere saw that, and she called up. I can't remember where she was. I think she was away somewhere, and she was quite upset about it. And she was quite upset because it was quite a blatant, truthful post about the climate crisis. It was quite blatant about how Violet experiences that emotionally. And it was a necessary discussion that I know others, parents or grandparents will have had with kids, or have had with friends and partners. But it was one that was recognizing the climate that we're in, and I think truth is very important. But it was also, what's the word for it? It's that challenge of how do you recognize the truth of the situation as we know it with regards to the science, but also how do we enable some sort of hope? And that's a challenge, but I am someone who acts out of a position of hope and optimism, and sometimes that's hard, being involved in the environment movement for 30 years and knowing that those 30 years have been the most destructive years in human existence. So it is, but I know very much from the science that ecosystems are complex, that Gaia is complex, that political systems are complex, that there's a lot of complexity in the world that we don't understand. And I also want to recognize and mention that we live in our own little bubble, and we are Yeah, but most of us are on the margins. We really are. And we're acting in a way that's on the margins that is tough. And I think it was really important to see, and I give props to everyone who was involved, seeing violent, but also others, facing a short time in prison to start with, but a possible longer time that, finally, some of the NGOs and the civil society groups really got their shit together and made an effort. And it's been interesting to see the last few days of the sentences that have been handed down since then. And yeah, one of my Brisbane comrades, Emma, today was in court. There's been others in court recently, and they haven't been sent to prison. And under the laws, they could have been. So that's a very interesting little political shift there. And history has shown that people do need to suffer and face oppression, for want of a better word, for laws to change. And my dear old mum, who's 77 and extremely conservative, I finally got her not to vote for Peter Dutton the last election. She's been there rooting for Violet, seeing it on the news, which has been lovely to see. And it does take sometimes people to experience that for the world to change and to people realize what these laws mean. And not only that does it affect these crazy greenies, that it could affect us all. And political freedoms are ridiculously important. And I think that's the final, it's also important to recognize that although this shit is happening, the political freedoms that we do have are pretty extraordinary compared to other places in the world that Sophie mentioned as an example. And there is carbon bombs all around the world, and some of them it's almost impossible. For example, some of the carbon bombs in China, for people there to get actively involved and oppose. And we do have carbon bombs here in Australia, in the Gully Basin, in the Beetaloo Basin, off the coast of WA, etc. And we do have a level of political freedom that we need to fight for, but we also need to use it. And yeah, what's happening to myself and what's happening to others around the country, don't let it scare you off. There is people that will have your back, and that's really important to know. And that level of solidarity is, extremely important. And you may not always, agree with someone or what tactics they use, whatever. I personally don't give a shit. They're peaceful. They're doing what means to them, what's important to them. So it's really important, that level of solidarity, in the grassroots movement, but beyond there as well. So, I want everyone to defend the rights we have, and not only to defend them, to use them, and to use them in the meantime, because, we are facing an existential crisis. What we're facing as people and what our kids or grandkids are facing is pretty scary stuff. So, my situation, most of you will know about. I'm sick of fucking talking about it. Excuse my French. I went to my youngest daughter's grade 6 graduation recently, and that's the first event I've been to in 2 years or so that I haven't been asked about the court case. And it was really good. It was, but my, it's been going how long? 2 years and 4 months. And before that, there was like secret hearings in the Supreme Court I didn't know about. So it's been going a long time. As of like an hour ago or 2 hours ago, my legal stuff is finished for a couple of weeks, but then it kicks off again. So I can't really give you the specifics of that, but it is draining. And, SLAP suits, which stands for Strategic Litigation Against Public Participation. SLAP suits are really draining, and they're there to like drain the life out of people with regards to their ability to fight it, and also funds. Like, Andy mentioned, David versus Goliath, like, yeah, Gautam Adani is, worth, inverted commas, about 200 billion, the, second or third richest person in the world, depending on stock prices. And yeah, I own half a suburban house in Brisbane with my wife, which if we lost the case, we would lose. And, what has happened has been reasonably extraordinary, and Adani are one of those companies that will go a bit beyond. So you know, the fact that they wanted to raid our house, like they applied to the Supreme Court and the Court of Appeal twice to raid our house for 2 days, that was legal. You know, the fact that they followed my wife around, they followed my kids around, that was legal. And it shouldn't be legal. And we need to emphasize, you know, what corporations are able to do, and that, you know, the law often supports those with the largest amount of money. And I've seen that. It's like and again, I can't go into specifics. I always have to assume that the other side, which I know monitor me pretty closely, on calls, but it's the personal effect has been pretty extraordinary. You know, not only have I been fighting the second or third richest person in the world, I've been fighting to keep my marriage alive. I've been fighting to protect my family. I've been trying to, you know, keep my kids away from some of this stuff because it's got nothing to do with them. But when you go after people like this, you involve their family. Like I mentioned, my, you know, mum as well. Like, my mum is 77. My dad's of very poor health and has been at risk of dying for a long time. And she worries about me. You know, it does have this effect, you know, that goes out there. So it's, I don't want to go too much more into that, is say that, you know, slap suits like the ones against me, which is more civil law, and it's, you know, very large amounts of money and lots of torts, etc. They normally fail. And it's important to know that slap suits are. The last case in Australia, comparable to the size of what's going on with myself, was in the 90s with Guns and Bob Brown and friends. And not only did they win it, Guns eventually fell apart and went bankrupt, and some Guns executives went to jail. So hey, we can like cross our fingers and hope so. But I don't know if I should say that or not. But it's important to recognize some of the shit that's going on. We need to fight against it, but also it's really, please don't let it stop you doing what you need to do, because that's why they do it. You know, that's why, you know, and it is a hard decision. It is a hard decision for me. Like, I went on the project recently talking about stuff, and that was a hard decision for me to do, to have that level of vulnerability to, mention the impact on my family, because Adani wants that out there. You know, the corporations want to know and they want to scare people off. So, you know, it's our job, but changing these laws and changing some of the systemic abuse of activists is more important. So the best that you guys can do is keep supporting, myself and Violet and Andy and others that are facing this, but also to really, not stop what you're doing and fight for what you love. Thanks for giving me the opportunity. I'm looking forward to hearing from Ian.
Thank you, Ben. That was really, really interesting. 203rd richest person in the world. Claim to fame, don't think anyone really wants. Ian, thank you so much. We'd love to hear from you.
Okay, well, thanks very much, Andy, and thanks very much for the invitation to talk to you. My background is 40 years in climate change, initially in the fossil fuel industry, and since about 1990 moving in the opposite direction. I'd like to come at this from a slightly different point of view. There's been a lot of talk about the rule of law in constraining climate activism and so on, and Sophie spelt that out very clearly, the disproportionate response that we're basically seeing. But if you turn around and look at what really is our problem, it's essentially the failure of leadership that we've seen now for more than 30 years in trying to address climate change, certainly politically, but also corporately. And if you look at them in order, I mean, politically, I don't want to sort of undermine the achievements of the Albanese government, because it has been a breath of change, I think, after years and years of conservative rule in this country. But the problem is that we're still really coming to grips with the issues. The first responsibility of any government is the security of the people. And it's pretty clear that the security of the Australian community is not very solid. We've seen the bushfires, we've seen the floods, We haven't yet seen major impact of climate in a way on the urban environments, although there's been some of that. But the fact is that what we're now seeing is a completely unprecedented impact of climate on this country, despite what the Murdoch press might say. These things are out of the ordinary. So politically, whilst we've made steps forward in terms of the improved preparedness to reduce emissions and what have you, it is still light years away from what has to be done. And I'll come back to that a little bit later. We're still really in the position of relative politics. You know, the government is saying, look, we're a hell of a lot better than the last lot, and therefore support us and will put in place what we promised at the last election. That, unfortunately, is not of much concern to the laws of physics. Nature is moving very, very quickly in terms of the escalation of climate. And we have to start really understanding what those risks are. And the astonishing thing is in Australia, the risks of climate change have never, ever been properly assessed. And when you listen to politicians talking, nobody ever discusses what the risks are. It's all about whether we can have gas or coal, or oil or renewables. It's not about what are we trying to solve. And until you start to actually focus on the risks properly, then you're never going to come up with the right solution. So we've had 30, 40 years now of continually refusing to address that issue. And as a result, we've had policies that are basically politically acceptable, but are completely unrelated to solving the real climate problem. If you look at the corporate world, the key responsibility of any board of directors, whether it be Adani, Ben, or anybody else, is that they really should look at the risks that their organizations are faced with and manage those risks responsibly. Now, our corporations are not doing that. What we have is a bunch of climate scenarios that are put together by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. They're picked up by things like the Task Force on Climate Risk Disclosure, or the what they call the Network for Greening the Financial System that the central banks are running. And it's all based around this IPCC work, which are ignoring some of the major risks that we currently face. They operate the so-called integrated assessment models, which try and combine climate and economics and so on, and they do a very good job in many respects. But the really important threats we face are the uncertainties, the things we actually can't quantify, but we know are there. These are, the threads you pick up from looking way back at the paleoclimate information millions of years ago, and seeing where things stood when carbon dioxide concentrations were at the levels we now have them. This is very hard to quantify, and it brings you into this arena of tipping points and the fact that climate change doesn't just evolve in a linear sense along with the increasing concentration of carbon in the atmosphere. There come points where you get a sudden change and it jumps from one state to another one, which is far less stable than we've had it over the last 11, 12,000 years of the Holocene geological period. Now, these things are the big risks. This is what the scientists have been concerned about for years. And we're now starting to see those things emerge around the world. If you look right now at the Northern Hemisphere and what's happening in North America, there's a very big change in the Arctic jet stream, which is going to bring very cold weather to large parts of North America in the next few days and a couple of weeks. Now, this sort of thing's been going on increasingly over recent time. It's very hard, as I said, to quantify it, but you know these things are there. And what you have to start doing is taking precautionary action to avoid them to the greatest extent we can. We can't avoid all of them anymore, unfortunately. Now, that's the sort of risk that is not being assessed corporately. And it's why people like Kevin Gallagher and Santos and Adani and what have you can, bravely state that gas is a transition fuel, or we're going to need this coal for the future of humanity and so on. The fact remains that you can't afford any new fossil fuel projects any longer. We're going to have some element of coal and gas in the system for a while to make the transition, but you don't go building major new projects at this point in time. And, this is the sort of risks that corporates are not assessing. And so at both levels, what we're seeing is a failure of leadership of both politicians and corporate leaders to fulfill their own responsibilities. And groups like the Australian Centre for Corporate Responsibility are sort of taking this up increasingly with more and more success, I might add. I think what's going on around the world is forcing these folk to realize that they have been missing out in really properly assessing this stuff, but there's not yet a real preparedness to accept it. So, what we're really faced with at this point in time, and it needs to be talked about far more openly, is the need to properly assess risks. The government has picked up federally on part of that in the sense that they've got the Office of National Intelligence to carry out an assessment of global risks on climate, but that doesn't include the domestic side of it. And we must have a domestic risk assessment done to complement the international, the global one. That information must be made publicly available, because unless the community know what we're faced with, it makes it extremely hard to get acceptance of the extent of change we've got to make. And that change is far greater than anything that's currently being talked about officially. I mean, this whole idea of net zero by 2050 is frankly nonsense. It's far too late. The game will be over long before that. And once these so-called tipping points start triggering, and some of them have already, they become irreversible. There's not much we can do about it. So in the view of myself and my colleagues and the scientists we talk to, the key task we have now, instead of net zero by 2050, we have got to get not to net zero, but to zero emissions as close to 2030 as we possibly can. Light years away from anything that's being talked about in official circles, politically or corporately. The second issue is something that is not even being discussed in this country, and that is we've got to draw down carbon from the atmosphere from the current level, which is about 420 parts per million carbon dioxide, or a bit of a 500 if you include the other greenhouse gases, to around 350, because 420 is not stable. I mean, you will not get a stable climate. You run the risk of a whole lot of other tipping issues occurring. The technology to do that is really embryonic still. And a lot of things are being talked about, like reforestation and regenerative agriculture. They're very important, but they don't act quickly. And we actually have to act extremely quickly now to address this. The result of inaction for the last 30 years is that we are now at the point where we're going to have to seriously think about geoengineering options to cool parts of the planet whilst these other measures take effect. And there's serious work now going on in places like Cambridge University with Sir David King and so on, to focus on cooling, for example, the Arctic, to slow down the entire global process, to give us time, essentially, buying time to let these other things start happening. So, this is a completely different picture from the official picture that's painted. And we've got to get these risks out and discussed publicly. It'll certainly help you folk in the activism arena if this is commonly known and openly discussed. And I mean, it's obviously fairly frightening stuff, but you just got to get over the threshold and accept we are where we are. And we now have to have serious debate about, okay, well, how are we going to fix it? Because there are ways of fixing it. But what it's going to need is a completely integrated approach to addressing the problem in a way that we don't currently have. We have bits of it happening all over the place, but it's not really being pulled together in terms of what I think is going to have to become national mobilization in the way that you actually have to work in wartime. I mean, you have to sort of recognize there is one big threat. I mean, there are many existential threats around. I think some of the groups I'm involved in, there's about 9 or 10 of them. But climate is the top. And if we don't fix that, then the rest become a bit academic. So we need mobilization that has got support across the political spectrum to really start accepting that challenge, reframe the direction we're going in the sort of context I've just talked about, and recognize in an international sense as that whilst we are having great debates about, the threats of China and the US versus China and everything else that's going on around the world, including the good Mr. Putin in Ukraine, the fact is that unless we get a quite unprecedented level of cooperation globally, we are not going to solve this. And every country has exactly the same problem. The Chinese have, in many ways, an even bigger problem than Australia does, and we're one of the most exposed.
I'm sorry to step in, Ian, but we're just running a bit over time, and wanted to just get a quick question in that everyone on the panel can answer.
Yeah, sorry, that was it, Andy.
That was great. No, I think it was an incredible compliment to the other speakers today. I really appreciate everyone we've heard from tonight. I just wanted to give everyone a quick update. I think no one would disagree that it's been incredibly interesting, and the panelists have already answered a lot. But we're going to have time for like one question to ask everyone, and then hopefully we might be able to send some questions through and get some written responses from our guests, and then we can forward them on to everybody. But for now, I think Rosa's got one question, and I would just like to get like a 30-second response, probably from each speaker. And then we're going to hear from Julie, from Stop Fossil Fuel Subsidies. So Rosa, what have we got?
Yes, well, I just want to preface it. There were so many really interesting questions. And yeah, as Andy said, hopefully we'll try and get the panelists to answer them after this if needs be. But the sort of one that kept coming up with different phrased different ways is the age-old question that I'm sure we all think about, which is how do we get everyday Australians to be outraged by how planet protectors are treated and the critical nature of the climate emergency. And that one, yeah, just came cropping up in lots of different ways. So that seems to be the one that many people want to know the answer to. And I was wondering, Andy, can we start with Sophie as well, please? Because I think she has to dash off.
Yes, so sorry about that. I've got to race out to something I'd already committed to. So that question, how to convince people. So what I try and do when I talk to people is I always talk about how I see this as our human rights crisis. So, often Australians see the, human rights issue as something that happens to people overseas, far away in the Middle East, in China, whereas I'm like, this is your human rights crisis that is going to impact you and the people you love in our lifetimes. So that's my number one tip for that conversation. And then Rosa, I forgot the second part of the question.
It's in the chat, and it's the question is, how do we get everyday Australians to be outraged by how planet protectors are being treated and the critical nature of the climate emergency?
I think, making it personal, highlighting the fact that climate protesters are just like you and me. They're not some kind of strange, cult, or that's people from all walks of life are making sacrifices to highlight this emergency, and just also I think highlighting that they can do something. So the fact that increased attention, people calling their local members, we do feel like the fact that, Emma didn't receive a custodial sentence today is because of this attention. So to actually do something, first get outraged, but then do something, and not just like something on Facebook. Call your member. The Greens' new bill that's been introduced that we'll see in Parliament in Feb, Labor will vote against that. Unfortunately, I think that's pretty safe to say. But call up your local ALP member and tell them what you think about it and how disappointed you are, because of the history of protests that got us the 8-hour working day and that union history of the Labor Party. But unfortunately, I think that's what's going to happen in Feb. But really, we should use that vote as a moment to really, I think, galvanise the movement and get attention on this issue. And sorry, that was more than 30 seconds.
No worries. Thanks, Sophie. Ben, you can choose maybe one part of the question to answer.
Yeah, my simple answer to that is that we need to get more everyday Australians in fucking trouble and get them active and getting them in trouble. I believe that that's sort of more, sounds a little bit blatant, but yeah, most of us are not usual people. We pretend we are, but we're not, and we do this for a reason, and we're engaged in different ways for a reason, and that I'm really glad that there's doctors for climate action, and there's scientists, and there's vets, and there's, sports people, and all this sort of, groups emerging out there, and those people taking more pointed radical action and, threatening the system in their own way, and, being a bit braver is important, because people, associate with those people, they recognize those people, they respect those people. And seeing them risking getting in trouble will really highlight the repressive nature, not only of the state, but of corporations, but also who we protect. Like, the repressive nature of the state protects their donors, which are, coal, gas, and other corporations.
Nice one. Violet, over to you.
I mean, to very much echo Ben, I think that we need to be sort of modeling the urgency of the situation and engaging with protests that is, comparable to the threat that we face. And I think one thing that sort of divides the movement, there's a lot of people engaged with the climate emergency, but one thing that divides the movement is people focusing on single issues, which I know, coming from fossil fuel subsidies, that's sort of a thing, but we have to realize that every single banner of this movement is really trying to fight the larger issue. And so don't be precious about your brand, just jump on board and find solidarity with each other. And if somebody's mobilizing, mobilize, and find your courage. I mean, it's pretty obvious what we've just seen. Happy to say with that.
Thank you. Ian, lucky last.
Okay, well, I'll just come back quite simply to the question of risk. And I think what would be really important now is to get people to be asking their political representatives and corporate leaders they're coming in touch with as to why they are failing in their fundamental obligations to our society. Why do you understand the risks of climate change? Have you thought about this? And what are you doing about it? And why are you breaking the law by not taking account of these sort of realities? And there's enough information out there now to fashion this sort of campaign, I think, pretty solidly.
Excellent. Thank you very much. All right. Well, now, everybody, we're going to pass over to Julie from Biddleman Menang country in Southwest WA, and hoping to just hear more about what's coming up next with Stop Fossil Fuel Subsidies, how people can get involved, and other ways to participate. And then we're going to be having breakout rooms, connecting, saying hello. So keep tuned in. Julie, you there?
That wasn't a good start. I was on mute. Just really so beautiful to see so many people here, really excited. I'm going to talk a little bit about how to get involved, because actually that question just dovetailed perfectly into what is next, how do we do this? How do we get other people outraged? How do we get people involved? So just really briefly, I'm Julie. I live in Southwest WA, which is one of the fastest drying climates in the world. We've lost 30% of our rainfall in 20 years. It's terrifying. I'm watching our forest die, and tourists are coming saying, the beautiful forest. People are very oblivious still. So I guess the people in this room are here because we really care and we know. And once we know, we can't unknow. So I'm a mother and I am an ordinary person, but I find myself in doing this work because this work is proportionate and necessary. So we did put this forum together really quickly in the circumstances. So we hope we can do more of this. And we've actually just put in the chat a link to some upcoming kind of casual orientations, get-togethers to talk about, you know, what we are doing next and how people can get involved, because at the end of the day, it's going to take all of us to do this. Violet talked about 3.5% of the population. I'd like to really consider what we have done with less than 0.2 of the population. So, you know, that's on the really positive thing. We've got 100 people here collaborating, working together. We can do this. We can change the course of history. Have every confidence that if we do the work, we build our courage like we've seen so many people in this room do. I also want to acknowledge a lot of other people here that I know have taken civil resistance and direct action and are sacrificing, as well as those people right at the very forefront of the front line. So like we said, mass civil resistance is the proportionate and necessary response. So this work actually has many, many aspects to it, and it requires a significant support network and many hands to do lots of varied tasks. It's way more than the amazing people sitting on the front line. We say that it takes at least 5 people in support of every person who is doing the frontline civil resistance. So, you know, you don't throw soldiers into battle without any backup support. You certainly shouldn't, because they're going to get slaughtered. I mean, that's just like the nuts and bolts of that, because, you know, if we've got solidarity, we've got a big support network, a big base, then we can cushion our work, be very, very strong, and we can do the work that's necessary. I saw Violet laughing there, so it wasn't the best analogy. So, you know, at the end of the day, we need more people. We just need more people. Without more people, we can't do what is necessary. So we are too small. But like I said before, how much we are achieving with so few people. This is active work and it's got lots and lots of layers. So whether you've got an hour a week or 5 days a week, we need us all. So our particular campaign, Stopping Fossil Fuel Subsidies, as all the speakers have talked about, and Andy at the beginning, is a very concrete step in changing the course of history. So it's something that people can really grasp hold of. It's actually causes a dilemma for our government. We showed our videos at the beginning, our very, very reasonable demands of government, you know, to in Fireproof Australia, get better firefighting equipment for our emergency services people, to rehome Australians who have suffered climate catastrophe and collapse already. Stop Fossil Fuel Subsidies is going to make a massive difference. As Ian said, you know, we're already a certain way down the line, but stopping those subsidies will bring down emissions immediately and change so much. I'm not going to go into that, but I guess it's more about what we can do. So to make that pivotal change happen, we gain that focus, we educate people, and we collaborate. totally acknowledge that this is very hard work and outside most of our comfort zones. It's certainly outside my comfort zone, but it's also incredibly empowering when we actually do what's necessary. We are courageous people. I'm sure that all of the people in here are absolutely dedicated and building their courage muscles. And, you know, for me personally, like my personal growth is kind of off the charts. And that's great, because that, you know, there's other things, other layers of this for us as humans as well. So when we have enough people, as Violet and a couple of others people has alluded to, that the whole thing flips over. You know, 3.5% of the population non-violently taking action cannot be ignored. And history has demonstrated and shown that. So we actually very actively have 3 pathways to action. So I'm sure a lot of people came here because they were very interested in the actual action that was taken. So we have pathways to taking direct action. So for the people who want to do what Violet and other people have done, we call that our direct action pathway. And it's a commitment to learn about and participate in non-violent civil resistance. So that's one of our pathways. And the second one is keeping this movement running. So like we're building a really strong foundation, those 5 or even more people supporting in either legal sense, a media sense, caring for our community, doing, as I'm doing now, training and talks, making phone calls, building our movement, making us strong and resilient. And it also keeps us very nourished. So that pathway is to join our team and our working groups. And again, whether you've got an hour a week or 5 days a week or 7 days a week, we need us all to participate in that. And the third pathway is to donate. So if people really don't have the capacity to put time into this, then donations are incredibly important. Rose is just putting as well, because unfortunately this is expensive work as well, as we've heard from our speakers. You know, going up against the judicial system is quite an expensive thing to do. It's a very, very good deterrent. I think some of the costs involved in these, well, obviously Ben is in a position where he's totally compromised, and I think some of the lawyer fees and fines stretch into the tens of thousands, both as individuals and as groups. So we really do need money to support this work. And also we need to keep our engine room running, which is things like Zooms and, you know, our database and stuff like that. So just wanted to do a really quick reality check. We do need all of us. It's not your average job. It is exciting, exhilarating, and being part of making history. We're a really young movement, and we do very much have solid structure in theory, but we actually really struggle with our capacity to orientate people and grow our movement. That's just the honest truth. So sometimes we get stuck in a little bit of a cycle because it's very difficult for few of us to actually bring other people in. So we plan to use like a buddy system to try to get people involved and upskilled. So I guess we just do really sort of ask people to be a bit patient with us while we orientate and support people moving into those kind of roles and becoming really active in this work. As I say, it's a very active kind of thing. I personally think, I know that lots of people have said, you know, like contacting doing all the traditional things, petitions and letters and talking to our politicians. And I've done that for 25 years. And unfortunately, I personally think that I just can't do that now. I think we have to go for making pivotal change very fast. And this to me is the logical way, it's the non-violent way. And that is definitely something I think all of us are, you know, very clear about, but it can be achieved. So despite our size, we have achieved incredible things with very brave people that I'd like to really acknowledge across the board. So I think we need to honour that we all have an opportunity to contribute to this and honouring the sacrifice that people like Violet and Ben and I know many other people in this room, I know personally have really sacrificed a lot. So I think it's really important that we take that right deeply inside ourselves and that we don't leave those people on a limb. We're all in this together. We all live on this beautiful planet. And also just acknowledging that, you know, we tend to get hit on all sides because we challenge the status quo. So we make our families and friends uncomfortable. Ben mentioned about, you know, actually having to fight for his family. I've experienced a bit of that. I make my family a little bit uncomfortable because they love me and they don't want to see me getting in trouble, etc. So we get challenged by the media, we get challenged by the authorities, we get challenged by the police and the judicial system. We can be really unpopular. So we need each other and that really, really strong foundational base to be able to do this work well. We can feel alone, but on the other hand, incredibly awesome, beautiful people are the people that do this work. So that's a massive contribution and so important and a very, very growing experience. So just really quickly, I'm almost there. We've got the links in the chat. So we do actually really need to continue this work. We have to, and like Ben said, let's not be scared off. Let's grow. Let more of us do it. Once we have thousands of people on the street, we can't all be arrested. We can't all be thrown in jail. Certainly not with being noticed. Big time. There'd be thousands of families up in arms. What's happening to my mother? What's happening to my daughter, my son, my grandchild? So we've heard the government say, let's throw the book at them. You know, they've literally saying that we are threatening a way of life. I think it's quite ludicrous, isn't it? And I think that's one of the things that I'm using in that thing about getting people outraged. Like, what way of life? You know, this stuff is aimed at us citizens standing up for our very existence. So pretty much to finish up, you know, it's a pretty terrifying proposition. And Gandhi said, first they ignore you, then they laugh at you, and then they fight you hard. And that's pretty much where we are. And so I'd like to extend my gratitude to everybody who has stood up and is standing up, because we've reached the fight. So now we need to build and continue that fight. But without more people doing this work, we really can't. So I pose the question of, what's the most important thing that you can be doing with your life right now? People say they would stand in front of a bus to prevent their children being harmed. So I think we really have to stare ourselves down and say, are we actually standing in front of the bus? Or are we letting it come towards us fast? So I've met the most incredible people doing this work. Once you know, you can't unknow. I think we've heard from so many people today. Have been very confronted by the reality of the society that we live in. But I'm also incredibly invigorated by humanity and what people do to be in service to each other and our planet. So we are setting up 2 or 3 next sessions, which are in the chat in the next few days or week. Just come and have a chat, come and ask some questions, and we can share more about how we work and how you can get involved. We'd love to see you there. So back to Andy. Thanks for your patience. Been heard a lot today, guys. Thanks, Andy.
Yeah, so you're probably aware that we're about at time. So basically, I think probably people are pretty happy to have a chat. We're going to have breakout rooms in a minute, but the aim is to stop the fossil fuel subsidies as a step to stopping the fossil fuels and having a safe climate. And I think Ben has offered to do a rev up about this, and then we'll go to some breakout rooms. But just be great to, click on those links, RSVP to come along over the next week or 2 or 3 to come and hang out and get more involved. And if you can't, chuck a donation in the tin would be great. And also, just before I forget, 5 p.m. State Library, Saturday. Is it Saturday? Friday, tomorrow. Yeah, 5 p.m. tomorrow, State Library, Victoria, Naarm is swarming on the street, protest action. So stand up for your right to protest and get amongst it. Over to you quickly, Ben, and then let's all hang out for a bit.
Look, thanks, Andy. I appreciate people's patience, but it's been great to hear the perspective of everyone. I just wanted to, this is something I've been involved in the movement, as I mentioned before, one way or another for 30 years, and it's been quite a journey, and I'm obsessed with strategy. But I also know that, and it was great to hear Julie's perspective, and I also know that people get involved in issues, or they're involved in particular asks because it's strategically useful. And what I want to put across to people there that I know and love, that, this is the time that we really go after fossil fuel subsidies. The last federal government, no fucking chance, excuse my French. Some of our state governments, it's very hard, and fossil fuels are subsidized the whole way down the line, everything from exploration onwards. And it is a significant boon for that industry, and in an industry that, is slowly dying, but dying too slowly. So, the subsidies are very important. As, Ian was mentioning, we have seen some, move from the federal Labor government, and they are a government that we can influence, and they're under threat, from the Greens and independents around the country. And we have, a political moment, and, taking away what are very large subsidies for very large damaging projects is ridiculously important. And it's not only ridiculously important with regards to the impact we can have on emissions, but us who are here, who are fighting for our political and civil rights, it's a very important issue that we can focus on. Because if, myself or Julie or Ian or Rosa or whoever are arrested and threatened with jail around this issue, the amount of people around Australia who support getting rid of fossil fuel subsidies is very large. I remember with the Stop Adani battle, when we were trying to get rid of a $1 billion loan to the Adani Corporation under the NAIF loan, the electorates that were closest to the mine, there was still 70% against the subsidy. It's very large support all around the country because it's their money. And it's like, people get that fossil fuels are dangerous and they know about jobs, but when you put to them that it's your money, and it's your money going to these people who are earning ridiculous amounts of money and profits, etc., they get pissed off. And if any of us get in the shit, for want of a better word, because we're fighting to save their money, that's different than it is, if people get in trouble where we're fighting for something that they see as marginal. This is not a marginal ask, it's the basics. So I think it is a really important thing that we can all fight for. I would like to, back up what Julie was saying, is that, people know that I've been out of because of my court case, away for a couple of years. I'm really, really keen to get involved in this issue and fight for this issue. I think it's a really strategic time to do it. So I'd like to encourage people to go along to info sessions, chat about it in the groups, etc., and say, how can I make a difference? Because we have to move politics. We can't just do what we're doing. We have to move politics. We have to move the legal structure. We have to move corporations as well. We can't just live in our own little world and do our thing. So I know that this is a really key achievable aim. And if we have an achievable aim and we do it, that's, it makes us feel good, because we often, in the environment movement, we often lose, and it's nice to win.
That's awesome. Thanks, Ben. On that note, I think it's time to, Daisy, we have a small little funny thing to do, I think, before we go into breakout rooms. I'm asking Daisy if they're around to instigate this. It looks like they're getting ready.
I have an issue here because I've got 2 children asleep in the house that I'm near. So, to do it quietly my end. But what we do when we have our Stop Fossil Fuel Subsidies meeting is we end it with a nice reveling shout of "for fuck's sake," because it makes us feel connected and yeah, leaves us on a bit of a high. So I'd like you all to take yourselves off mute, or if someone can, and we want to. I'll say "Stop Fossil Fuel Subsidies," and you all say "for fuck's sake." Ready? Ready. Okay. So, stop fossil fuel subsidies.
For fuck's sake!
For fuck's sake! Thanks, team.
Thanks, Daisy. Excellent. So plenty of that to come. Now we might jump into some breakout rooms for everyone who wants to hang out.